Hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about ethics and social research. As social workers, we're already familiar with the idea of having a code of ethics because we practice based on the NASW Code of Ethics. As social work researchers, we also abide by the Code of Ethics from NASW. However, in addition to this code, we also have federal regulations that we must abide by, as do other researchers who are not in social work. So before we begin, I just have one question for you all. Are you ready? Are you super excited? Oh wait, I guess that's two questions. But in any case, are you as excited as the girl in this picture? I was going to say I hope so, but maybe I don't want you guys this excited. Okay, well, just, have fun with the presentation. Don't get too excited, I guess, but pay attention, and hopefully this will help with understanding the reading a little bit more. Okay, so let's first start off by talking about ethics in terms of what they are. So a little definition, if you will. Okay, so ethics involve a moral duty. So morality is involved in some way. They are also about obligation and responsibility to act professionally. The way I like to think about it is that they help tell us what's right versus wrong. What's the correct behavior, the behavior that's not going to be harmful, versus the incorrect behavior or behavior that might cause harm. The purpose of having any code of ethics is to protect people. In the case of research, it's to protect research participants. What I'd like to do now is go over 4 reasons for having ethical codes. These are 4 reasons that were outlined by David Resnick, so the next few slides are from his work, and in fact, they are direct quotations. Okay, number 1. Norms promote the aims of research, such as knowledge, truth, and avoidance of error. For example, prohibitions against fabricating, falsifying, or misrepresenting research data promote the truth and minimize error. So what does this mean? What we're really talking about is fraud, okay, and unethical research. But what I would like you to sort of keep in mind in terms of having a little perspective is that cases of unethical research or fraudulent research are definitely the exception and not the norm. So just again, by way of perspective, probably for every case of unethical research, there are hundreds or maybe even thousands that are conducted ethically. Of course, this is not to minimize the great harm that's caused by unethical research. It's just to, as I said, provide a little bit of perspective. Okay, number 2. Since research often involves a great deal of cooperation and coordination among many different people in different disciplines and institutions, ethical standards promote the values that are essential to collaborative work, such as trust, accountability, mutual respect, and fairness. As social workers, we should immediately identify and understand the importance of these values because they infuse our social work practice on a daily basis. Number 3, ethical norms help to ensure that researchers can be held accountable to the public. I'm going to highlight that word accountable because just like as social workers, we are held accountable to our clients, to our agency, and to our funding sources, so too are researchers accountable to their participants, their university or institution, and to the public that funds their research. For instance, federal policies on research misconduct, conflicts of interest, human subjects protections, and animal care and use are necessary in order to make sure that researchers who are funded by public money can be held accountable, there's that word again, to the public. This becomes really important to think about, especially when it comes to the distinction between public versus private funding. Later on, I'm going to ask you to read a timeline of research and cases of fraudulent research or unethical research. And I want you to pay attention to this theme of private versus public funding in terms of the issue of accountability. Number 4. The norms of research promote a variety of other important moral and social values, such as social responsibility, human rights, animal welfare, compliance with the law, and public health and safety. And again, just like with the other values, these should be very familiar to us as social workers. Okay, let's take a little break. We're going to pause the video, take a stretch. For me, this involves usually getting some coffee, but meditation works just as well, or whatever it is you need to kind of refresh your brain before we move on, because I don't want you all to look like this. I would rather you look like this and pay attention. So take a quick break, pause the video, and then come back when you're ready. Hi again, welcome back. I hope that helped and that you're ready to go on with this presentation. Okay, so let's talk about what research was like without ethics. There are a number of infamous cases that are well publicized that you may be familiar with. For example, the 1932 to 1972 syphilis research study in Tuskegee. There was the Milgram obedience experiment. Of course, the Stanford prison experiment. And I say of course because many people who were psychology undergrads especially are probably very familiar with this one. What I've provided here are links to YouTube videos that I would like you to watch to just familiarize yourself with the details of some of these experiments. The YouTube videos are relatively short, about 10, maybe 13 minutes each. I think the Stanford one is about 13 minutes. But go ahead and watch those. And then also, I'd like you to read this research ethics timeline by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. That's available online at that link. I've also made it available as a PDF on Moodle if you're more comfortable reading it that way. But go ahead and take a look at this information in order to really kind of see what can happen when we don't have ethical guidelines. Oh, and also, by the way, I put all of these links on Moodle as well. As a result of these types of cases of unethical research becoming known, various ethical codes have been established over the years to guide researchers in terms of how to conduct research ethically. The first of these was established after the Nuremberg trials, during which the extent of Nazi experimentation on victims was revealed. This resulted in the Nuremberg Code, which mandated that every research subject be informed of the following: the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which the experiment was to be conducted, all inconveniences and hazards that might be reasonably expected, and the possible effects of the experiment on the health of the subject. So all of these together essentially make up the informed consent process that we still use today. So keep this in mind. I'm going to refer to this again when we talk a little bit more about informed consent later. In 1974, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research was established. And this was as a result of the National Research Act that was passed by Congress. So I want you to kind of look at that time frame here that we're talking about, 1974, whereas the Nuremberg Code was in 1946. Well, if you remember back, the Tuskegee research study, the syphilis research study, took place well before and well after the Nuremberg Code was established for, over 2 decades after that code. So as a result of that type of unethical research and others that were taking place over the intervening years, Congress decided to enact a law in order to create a commission that could investigate these cases. Now, just as a side note, one other thing that the National Research Act did is that it also established the institutional review boards, which I will talk about later on in the presentation. I just want to mention that here. 5 years later, in 1979, the National Commission publishes the Belmont Report, Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research. The Belmont Report is the ethical code that all researchers had to follow. And in fact, we still follow it today. Now, of course, in the intervening years, there have been updates and revisions, especially as new technologies come up, for example, social media and what have you now. But essentially, the principles that underlie the report are still what guide research practice today. So let's talk a little bit just briefly about the Belmont Report in terms of the 3 basic ethical principles that underlie it. The first is respect for persons, second, beneficence, and third, justice. I'm going to go over each one of these individually. Well, let's start with respect for persons. There are 2 ethical convictions that underlie this principle. Individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. What do we mean by autonomous? Basically, it means to be able to independently make a decision about whether or not to participate in a research study. Now, this is referring to adults who have the legal authority to make decisions about themselves, in comparison to those who have diminished authority, who do not have legal authority to say yes or no to participation in research. So when we're talking about diminished autonomy, we're mostly referring to children or adults who have cognitive or developmental disabilities and who are not able to legally make decisions for themselves. So in terms of these 2 ethical convictions, again, it's just to acknowledge autonomy and to protect those with diminished autonomy. Another way of thinking about beneficence is in terms of obligation. So there are 2 general rules that have been formulated as complementary expressions of the beneficent actions in this sense. The first is do no harm, and this is very similar to the medical profession in general in terms of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. The second is that we have an obligation to maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harm. So the key here are these 2 words, benefits versus harms. And in research, this is referred to as the harm-benefit ratio. So generally speaking, we want the harm that can be caused to participants to be less than the benefits of the research knowledge gained. The ratio has to favor the benefits. The third and last principle underlying the Belmont Report is justice. And this is a different ratio in terms of the participants of the research versus the benefits of the research. So the question is, who should bear the burden of the research and who should be the beneficiary of the knowledge gained from that research? For example, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, the burdens of serving as research subjects fell largely upon poor hospital patients, while the benefits of improved medical care flowed primarily to private patients. In this case, there was no justice in these studies. Therefore, the selection of research subjects needs to be scrutinized in order to determine whether some classes, such as welfare patients, particular racial and ethnic minorities, or persons confined to institutions are being systematically selected simply because of their easy availability, their compromised position, or their manipulability, rather than for reasons directly related to the problem being studied. So think of it another way. If I'm studying poverty, for example, then it makes sense for my sample to be comprised of individuals who are impoverished. If, however, I'm studying substance abuse, and even though poverty may play some role in it, if I really want to understand substance abuse in general, then I have to include all individuals in my sample. It doesn't make sense to focus on impoverished individuals alone. Okay, time for a stretch break. So why don't you go ahead and pause the video, take a stretch, do some break dancing if you want and can, and then come back. Just a quick little break, 2 minutes maybe, and then come back and we're in the home stretch. Oh, no pun intended. Really, I didn't mean that. Okay, welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the IRB, Institutional Review Board. The role of the IRB ultimately is to protect the rights and welfare of individual research participants. This is accomplished by having the IRB assure that the following 8 requirements are satisfied. You can find 7 of these 8 requirements on page 53 of your textbook. It's in table 3.1 at the top, I believe. So let's go ahead and go over them. 1. Risk to subjects are minimized. 2. Risk to subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. And 3. Selection of subjects is equitable or fair. So these 3 here, the top 3, we've already gone over in terms of, for example, the harm-benefit ratio, justice, those 3 principles that we talked about. What I'd like to do is focus a little bit on the informed consent requirement. So informed consent is sought from each subject or his or her legally authorized representative. Remember back when I mentioned the 4 elements of the Nuremberg Code were related to the informed consent? So this is where it comes back in. So those 4 elements essentially make up the informed consent process. All research subjects have to be told all that information in terms of what they will be asked to do and for how long and in what way, etc. In terms of informed consent, however, one thing to know is that there's a difference between consent versus assent. When we use the term consent, we're referring to autonomous agents, again, adults. Assent is for children or adults with diminished authority who have the ability to participate in a study, but they don't have the legal authorization to make the decision on their own. One thing to know about assent, however, when it comes to children, is that generally speaking, a child has to be about 8 years or older in order to provide assent. Younger children, such as those who are preschool aged or what have you, they don't have to undergo the assent process. And that has to do with the fact that developmentally and cognitively, they're not really ready to understand what all is involved in the same way that an older child would. Okay, so I just spent all this time telling you about how important it is to inform potential participants about everything that they are going to go through and what the study involves. But there is one little exception, well, maybe not so little, called deception. Now, when we think of deception, we kind of think of it as lying. And in most cases, it is lying. And many people would consider that to be unethical. But in some cases, knowing the purpose of a study may affect the behavior or the performance of a participant in the study. So in those cases, we as researchers can let the participant know that we're not telling them everything. So in that sense, it's not the same as lying. So deception used in research is not the equivalent of lying because the potential participant is told ahead of time that they're not being told everything. And usually this just means that they're not told the ultimate purpose of the study or the research question. They're still told about everything that they'll have to do in the study, so they can make an informed decision in that sense as well. But one key thing that has to happen if deception is used is that there has to be a debriefing. And that generally just means that the researcher at some point has to tell the participant what they weren't told in the beginning. And this can happen immediately after participation in the study, or it can be after the study concludes. Generally, a researcher may wait until after the study is concluded because they don't want the research participant to tell other potential participants about what the purpose of the study was. Okay, so that's consent versus assent, deception and debriefing, covering requirement number 4 of the IRB requirements. So let's move on to number 5. Informed consent is appropriately documented. This basically just means that there's a form that a participant has to sign saying that they've read the form and that they agree to participate. If it's an online survey, it might just be a box that they have to click that says, yes, I agree to participate. When appropriate, the research plan makes provisions for monitoring data collection. So this requirement refers to who's collecting the data, where it's being stored, etc. So generally there are requirements for example, locked file cabinets or password protected computers, things of that nature. Okay, number 7, privacy and confidentiality of research subjects is appropriately protected. Let's unpack this just a little bit to make sure we understand how the term privacy is being used in this case. So privacy in general has to do with our personal information and the ability to protect who has access to that information. It's similar in research, except it's not about personal information per se in the sense of, let's say, demographics or gender or race, ethnicity, income, things like that, but rather it's about the ability to identify who was in the study and to potentially link the data to individual people. And that has to do with the difference between confidentiality and anonymity. In confidentiality, the researcher or someone on the research team knows the identity of the person who is in the study. So the identity of the participant is known to the researchers. But what the researchers can assure is that none of that identifiable information will be made public. And so the information, the private information that identifies people who are in the study is kept confidential. Versus anonymity, where no one, not even the researchers, know who participated in the study. So anonymous surveys taken on computers are called anonymous because no identifying information is collected. No names, no birth dates, certainly no social security numbers. And in fact, IP addresses have to be stripped if they are collected by the survey technology. So that's the difference between confidentiality and anonymity. Confidentiality, someone knows who the participant is and can link it to their identifiable information. Anonymity, no one knows who participated in the study, and there's no way to link that person to the data. And here's the added requirement. When some or all of the subjects are likely to be vulnerable to coercion or undue influence, additional safeguards have been included. So what do we mean by coercion and undue influence? Well, think of it in this way. If you have a client who's receiving services and a researcher wants to interview them or study them in some way as part of an evaluation, let's say, Well, it's reasonable to think that they may feel obligated to participate because they're receiving services from the agency. They may fear that if they don't participate, that may somehow affect their services. Another example, prison populations. Prison populations are studied for a number of reasons, but they are vulnerable to coercion and undue influence because, again, like the clients, they may feel that if they don't participate, something bad will happen to them. And in fact, college students as well can be considered a vulnerable population in some cases. So, for example, um, there are a number of psychology experiments that students have to participate in order to receive extra credit, and sometimes it's even a requirement for a class. Well, one safeguard against having um, undue influence in that case would be to offer students an alternative assignment that they can complete in lieu of participating in a study, and yet they'll still receive the same number of points. So in that case, a safeguard has been implemented. There are additional safeguards for the other populations that I spoke of as well as other vulnerable populations out there. The key is to acknowledge the possibility of coercion and then to ensure that safeguards are in place. So those are the 8 requirements of the Institutional Review Board when they're reviewing all applications for research. The IRB has to make sure that these requirements are met before they approve a research study. In addition, the IRB reviews these documents on at least an annual basis just to track the progress of the study when it comes to the ethical code that is involved. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation on ethics and social research. But before you go, just real quick, don't forget to read the case for our class discussion in the next session. Here it is, but it's also available on Moodle. It's basically a little vignette about a social work agency providing services and wanting a researcher to evaluate their program. I want you to read the case, think about everything that I just went over, everything that's in the book in terms of the chapter that you read, and answer the question of what ethical issues must the researcher consider in order to evaluate the PTSD counseling program effectively. And again, this is available on Noodle. And last but certainly not least, here are the sources of all the images I used in order of the presentation. I mean, after all, this is a presentation on ethics, but you'll notice these on all of them if you're interested in locating such images. And that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you in class.